Bear in mind as you watch this that it isn't a comedy sketch. This is real life.
Is this real life?
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Democratic Socialists of America Convention.
If we want to defeat capitalism, we are going to need a party that will organize working people to fight for the demands that we want and to win socialism. Thank you so much.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade.
Sensory overload.
Yeah, because communist revolutions are notoriously peaceful and quiet. And what's this weird thing they're doing with their hands?
And to win socialism.
It's called jazz hands.
Jazz hands.
First used in early 2015 at a feminist NUS conference in the UK. It's a replacement for clapping, because clapping causes anxiety.
It is also triggering to my anxiety.
Yeah, these people are literally afraid of this. But they're totally going to lead a revolution to overthrow the entire global capitalist system.
Triggering to my anxiety. Quick point of privilege once again. Hi, James Jackson, Sacramento DSA, he, him. I have already asked people to be mindful of the chatter of their comrades who are sensitive to sensory overload, and that goes double for the heckling and the hissing. It is also triggering to my anxiety. Like, the be comradely isn't just for, like, you know, let's keep things civil or whatever. It's so that people aren't going to get triggered and so that it doesn't affect their performance as a delegate, okay? Your need to express yourself is important, but your need to express yourself should not trump or
He said Trump!
Triggering to my anxiety. Sensory overload.
So please don't clap, shoot up these. We have a lot of disabled comrades, and a lot of those are invisible disabilities.
You mean like the disability of being unable to handle everyday noises without having a nervous breakdown? Yeah, that's not a disability.
Don't really talk to anybody. Don't talk to cops. Don't talk to MAGA assholes.
Don't talk to anyone with testosterone levels higher than an amoeba. You might have a panic attack.
Triggering to my anxiety.
Take a deep breath.
Trump.
We have quiet rooms that are available. There's a range of options of these, right? Please don't go in that space with anything that's like an aggressive scent.
You mean like the stench of the 90 million victims of communism?
An aggressive scent.
Point of privilege, I'm a Tourette's victim with BO and an irrational fear of jazz hands. Bigots.
We are safe and we are strong.
Until someone forgets to state their pronouns or whispers too loudly, then you go cry in the quiet room.
Triggering to my anxiety.
Jesus Christ, for someone who suffers from sensory overload, you sure do shout a lot.
Triggering to my anxiety.
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.
Okay.
Oh my God, look, it's not. It can't be. Is it?
It is, ma'am.
And if you're wondering what triggered him,
Please do not use gendered language.
the sensory overload dude used the word guys.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want
Please do not use gendered language.
It is, ma'am.
Guys!
Take a deep breath.
Quick point of personal privilege. How in the holy f*** do you even get through a normal day? How do you even manage to leave your house, operate in society, and get back without emotionally liquefying? How are you going to even host a convention when you spend the entire first day getting triggered by each other's words and mannerisms?
Triggering to my anxiety.
I've seen less neurotic people at a bipolar incels anonymous meetup.
What up, DSA?
Sensory overload.
We're almost there. But thank you.
Triggering to my anxiety.
There must be something in the water.
Soy.
Solidarity forever.
Listen, I know vegans find it hard to muster up energy, but I've seen more enthusiasm at a Joe Biden retirement home visit. But Biden better buck up his ideas, because these people are taking over the Democratic Party. These are the people Democrats increasingly have to pander to. 2020 really is gonna be an absolute show.
Triggering to my anxiety.
It's absolutely crucial for you to help me fight the war on free speech by supporting me via Subscribe Star, link in description, and also signing up for my free newsletter at summit.news/newsletter.
The Tom Woods Show, episode 1464.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Brion McClanahan Week continues. We're talking to Brion McClanahan, obviously, who is the host of the Brion McClanahan Show. Brion spelled Brion. Brion is the author of numerous books, as I mentioned yesterday, PhD from the University of South Carolina. Very, very knowledgeable. Teaches at libertyclassroom.com. And today I thought we would talk about, let's say, some of the lesser-known presidents. Whether they were good or bad, just lesser known, and get Brion's thoughts on them, because Brion, after all, among other things, is the author of a book called 9 Presidents Who Screwed Up America. So he's got quite a lot to say about the president. So let's dive right in. Brion, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Appreciate it.
All right, second episode of Brion McClanahan Week. This time we're going to talk about unknown presidents, unknown to 99% of Americans, let's say. And I like how when you were proposing this, you said that we could just pick a few out of a hat if you want. So
right.
Why don't we pick one? Let's start with one you think is a good president people don't know about. I mean, the thing is, most people know about the bad presidents because they're the ones who are loved by everybody. But in terms of good presidents, of whom there have been some, you oftentimes haven't heard of them, especially the 19th century ones. So who would you say is the one who is, known to historians, obviously, but to the average American, basically unknown, but yet who was sort of a decent fellow, all things considered?
Well, if you want to go to the best, then it would be John Tyler. And anyone that's listened to me before knows that I think John Tyler is the best president in American history.
Okay, yeah. So let's start right there. I want you to defend that statement.
Right. So when I wrote my 9 Presidents Who Screwed Up America, I wanted to not only talk about the bad people, because look, we're all negative. This president stinks. They said, can we have something positive at the end of the book? And I said, sure. So I picked who I thought were the best 4 presidents, and that was 4 who tried to save her. And one of those 4 was John Tyler. And the premise of that book is that we should measure presidents on how they upheld their oath of office. And that's really the only measuring stick you can use. Did they uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States? I mean, that's their job. So I thought, okay, well, who did the best job of that? And it would have to be John Tyler, hands down. John Tyler assumed office in 1841 after William Henry Harrison died. And the cabinet called a meeting and said, okay, look, John, I know you're president, but we're going to run the show and you just sign off on whatever we do. And Tyler said, no, I'm president, so I'm going to make decisions based on what I think is right. And then you can go along with it or you can resign. He told him that. Well, eventually they all did resign, with the exception of Daniel Webster, and he even resigned later. But that was because Henry Clay was trying to pull the strings in the background. And the problem was that John Tyler was an old nullifier. This is a guy that the only person in the United States Senate that voted against the force bill, which was passed during the nullification crisis, was South Carolina. The only one who did. He made a speech on it. And people said, this is going to ruin your career. You can't do that. And we went out there and did it anyways. He was reared at Jefferson's table, essentially. His father and Thomas Jefferson were good friends. He was an old Republican of the early 19th century. I mean, he was like John Taylor of Caroline, but he's John Tyler. And so he gets into office. And of course, Clay thinks that we've got the Whigs in power now. The Whigs want a bank. The Whigs want internal improvements. The Whigs want tariffs. So Tyler vetoes all this stuff, and it drives Clay absolutely mad. And he was vetoing it because he said, look, this stuff's unconstitutional. I might think that internal improvements would be good. Maybe a bank would be all right, whatever. I can think all those things, but until you tell me in the Constitution where it's constitutional, I'm going to veto it. And so he's defending the Constitution. I mean, that's what his job is. Now, of course, there was a colleague from Virginia named John Minor Botts, who wanted to impeach him for this. He wanted to impeach Tyler for simply doing his job, which was vetoing unconstitutional legislation. He's allowed to do that. And it's funny. I mean, so he was actually, Tyler was, there were several impeachment proposals during Tyler's administration because he kept doing what the Whigs didn't want him to do. And then, of course, if you look at the one issue that I think a lot of people criticize him for is Texas. But there again, Texas, in my opinion, was brought into the Union constitutionally. It was through a joint resolution of Congress. Congress can admit new states to the Union. There's nothing illegal about that. The Congress or the Senate, those who opposed him, said, well, you need a treaty to do this. And he said, well, I mean, we didn't get that. We tried. We didn't get it. But the Congress can just admit new states if they want to. They can admit Texas. It's a state. It's the state of Texas. It was just an independent state at the time. It wasn't part of any union, but it was still certainly a state, just like any other state in 1776. So I think Tyler's just a fascinating character in his personal life. He was very upright, an interesting guy. He was married twice and very faithful to his wives. So he wasn't a scoundrel morally. In fact, he called his plantation Sherwood Forest because he was like an outlaw there. And his grandsons, not his great-grandsons, but his grandsons still live there. So he has all that personal stuff, which is funny in his life too, or interesting. I just found him to be fascinating. And I think that when you look at that oath, though, there's nobody better than John Tyler.
All right. So there's your case for John Tyler as the best president. All right. So now let's think about, let's say, names also not so well known, who maybe you don't necessarily like, but maybe you do. Well, like, how about, I think you mentioned Franklin Pierce as a possibility. So he's from New Hampshire. I remember reading about, was it, I forget whether it was a bill having to do with building like asylums for people with mental problems, and he vetoed it because it was unconstitutional. So I don't know if I'm remembering that right, but was he hardcore like that?
Absolutely. Franklin Pierce is one of those others. He's always at the bottom of the list, right? You get these presidential rankings. Oh, we're distinguished presidents, and here are your best presidents. And of course, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt right near the top. And then at the bottom, you're going to have Pierce and Andrew Johnson and James Buchanan.
Right.
All these, the bottom dwellers, right? But I like to go to the bottom dwellers because usually they're pretty good.
And by the way, just to situate this in everybody's mind, he's elected in 1852, just for everybody to know. Okay, so go ahead.
Right. Yeah, so Pierce is often criticized because he signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And, I mean, that is a sacrilege. How can you sign this into law? And he's supposedly a doughface, right? The term is a doughface, a northern man with southern principles. He was very good friends with Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was his Secretary of War. But Pierce, here's another guy that had just a horrible personal life. His all of his kids were killed. His wife died when everybody died in his life. In fact, his last son was killed while he was en route to Washington to become president. He was killed in a train accident, decapitated. Just horrible. So you got that, which of course is interesting to read about. But Pierce did veto that asylum bill because he said, look, if we pass this thing, essentially what we're going to say is that the general government can be in charge of health care. And do we want the general government in charge of all hospitals, all healthcare in the United States? Now, think about that in that was 1854, I think, is when he vetoed that bill. Think about that today. I mean, we talk about healthcare all the time. 1854, Franklin Pierce is saying, hey, if we do this, we're going to nationalize healthcare. And so I'm going to veto this bill. It's so prescient. And then, of course, he also vetoed several internal improvements bills. He actually vetoed 6 of those. So he's blocking internal improvements. This is something we don't even blink an eye at anymore. If the federal government wants to spend money on an interstate highway system, sure. If they want to spend money on the road in your neighborhood in front of your house, they're going to get federal funds to fix that road. Yeah, why not? But Pierce and others would say, well, how does that benefit New Hampshire if I'm building a road in Alabama? Am I going to drive on that road? Is anybody else going to drive on that road? No, but that's not generally from Alabama. So how would that benefit the U.S. or how would that benefit the taxpayers in other states? These are state responsibilities. So he's rock solid on the Constitution, good at foreign policy. He was certainly now some people would say, well, he's got the Onstan Manifesto that's trying to acquire Cuba, and there's these filibusters that he had no role in. But certainly he was much more interested in a non-interventionist foreign policy than modern presidents. So I think that's laudable. So all these 19th century presidents before Lincoln were very much, for the most part, non-interventionists. If you look at Pierce, if you look at Buchanan and Taylor, and these people were very much interested in a foreign policy that would be more in line with, say, George Washington than Woodrow Wilson.
All right, so let's say something about let me see, who's the other one? I had a list of them right here. Yeah, okay. How about, here's one everybody hates, and I don't mean Nixon, right? Because in their heart of hearts, the establishment still kind of respects Nixon on some level. Because they admit he did do some things that they would have to approve of. But I'm thinking James Buchanan. Right after Pierce, after Pierce.
Right.
You think they didn't like Pierce? Oh man, you haven't seen anything. Right. What is it just that Buchanan let the South go and didn't, at least, as it was happening, he wasn't going to use force to bring states back in. Is that what it is?
I think that's part of it, but Gutzman doesn't like Buchanan either. Look, I think it's that. It's also Dred Scott. The whole issue of Dred Scott, where Buchanan was actually involved in the decision, which is horrible. I mean, look, the fact that the president and the Supreme Court Chief Justice are trying to negotiate how they're going to rule so that they can supposedly
that's no good. Nobody denies that.
Right. But one thing I'll say about that, in Buchanan's defense, though, here's a guy from Pennsylvania. Again, he's a Northerner. He's considered a doughface, but he really wanted to try to end the slavery controversy. He thought it was an annoyance. We got to solve this thing somehow, right? We got these two sections are getting really antagonistic. They're fighting out in Kansas. We got to come up with some solution that will stop this thing. And I am a national president. I'm in charge of a national party, the Democrat Party, right? So we've got Northerners and Southerners. Let's come together on this thing and try to figure this out. And so that was Dred Scott. Now it's a miserable disaster, and it's a horrible view of due process. But I think in just looking back and trying to understand what he was doing, I can understand it. It was just the wrong way to do it. But otherwise, Buchanan, look, when you make the statement that secession caused the war, well, if that's true, then why didn't we have war between December of 1860 and April of 1861? Or why didn't we have war between December and March is more accurate? Because Buchanan wasn't going to go and use force to bring the South back in the Union. So that simply blows apart the entire argument that secession caused war. Because for nearly 4 months, we didn't have it. And Buchanan was saying, look, we're not going to, his Attorney General, Jeremiah Black, had written a defense of Buchanan's actions and saying, look, secession is illegal, but so is using force to stop it. That's also illegal. So we can't do that. So that was Buchanan's position. And it's peace, right? He did try to resupply Fort Sumter at one point, and that ship was shot at, so he turned it around and didn't do anything else. That was it. That was January of 1861. He didn't make another move. So, Buchanan's position was that, we only had 7 states out of the Union at that point. We still had North Carolina in the Union, Virginia, Tennessee, all those states were still in the Union. So he's saying maybe we can work this out and negotiate and get them back in at some point and not have to go to a shooting match over this. And I think that's the more admirable position than simply saying we're going to send in the troops to Fort Pickens and Fort Sumter, and we're just going to hope it settles itself out. Lincoln knew exactly what would happen because he was told, if you send supplies into Sumter, if you send supplies to Fort Pickens, it's going to cause war. And it did. And so Lincoln knew exactly what he was getting into. And I think that's Buchanan is good on that. He was also good on domestic policy in terms of limited government. He was certainly in line with the Democrat position of the 19th century in maintaining a limited, strict construction of the Constitution when it came to internal improvements and things of that. Now, he was pro-tariff. I will say this. Buchanan was pro-tariff. The moral tariff was passed before he left office. So from Pennsylvania, he liked the idea of tariffs, but he generally wasn't as bad as people make him out to be.
Let's say you're assessing the first half of the 19th century and you have to find the worst of the presidents. Who would that be?
The first half. So you're saying up to 1850? Who would the worst be?
Yeah.
Andrew Jackson.
Oh, really?
No, yes. If you look at federal power, a close second is Polk. But Polk, at least, we had an independent treasury established during the Polk administration, which was good. The tariff was reduced, which was good. But Jackson, other than the bank veto, and you got to understand why he did it, Jackson didn't veto the bank because he had some moral qualm about the bank. He vetoed the bank because Henry Clay was for the bank. That's it. Jackson, in fact, David Crockett pointed this out. David Crockett was his arch political enemy. A lot of people don't know that, but Crockett did not like Andrew Jackson. They're both from Tennessee, and Crockett thought that Jackson was a shizer, right? He's somebody that's he's just not interested in he doesn't have any principles. And so he thought that Jackson was a bank man. He thought Jackson was a guy that was for all these things. And but once you got on his personal enemies list, it was terrible. Now, Jackson, there's a reason why we have the whole Whig Party, because of Andrew Jackson. We wouldn't have had it unless Jackson was threatening to use force against South Carolina. So this is why he was called King Andrew. And you can certainly make a case that was the intellectual forebear of Abraham Lincoln in his attempts to use and ultimately using force against the South in 61. So Jackson was abusing the Constitution while at the same time rhetorically saving the Constitution. Now, that's not a good thing to do. And I know that Brad Berzer likes Jackson. I like Brad's book on Jackson. But I mean, Jackson's in my 9 Presidents book, and he was one of the ones too that people pointed to and said, well, how can you say Andrew Jackson's a bad president? There's also the whole issue of the Bank of the United States when it finally was going out of business, essentially, and Jackson illegally withdrew all the deposits from it. He's breaking the law, and nobody called him out for that. I mean, the 2 Secretary of Treasuries didn't want to do it. Finally, Tawney says, I'll do it. And so that's that. But Jackson was really problematic for central power. We have to remember that in 1787, Jefferson called Jackson a dangerous man. That was long before Jackson was president. Jefferson could already see that Jackson was going to be problematic, and he ultimately was.
I think, Brad likes a lot of the Andrew Jackson, the man, and some of his exploits before becoming president. And I think there are some aspects of his presidency that he can approve of, but not quite all. I mean, I look at Jackson, and you're right. I mean, obviously his views of executive power are not mine, but also I think about I think Calhoun at that time was concerned about this idea that the president, which I believe is how Andrew Jackson portrayed himself, he's like the president. He's the president of the American people. Like he conceives of himself as being above the other. Like, for example, senators and representatives, because you just represent some dinky portion of the country, but I'm the person who represents the will of the entire people in the aggregate. And Calhoun was saying there is no such thing as the American people in the aggregate. We have a set of societies here, each of whom is distinct, each of which is distinct from the other. So just this whole way of thinking is bound to produce problems. And of course, the handling of the nullification crisis and the force bill are certainly not ideal. But at the same time, I mean, he's not a big government president in the sense that he's not launching any major initiatives. I mean, no president of the early 19th century did. But there was a slogan associated with Jackson, which was equal rights. But what equal rights meant in that context was everybody is equal in the sense that nobody gets a damn thing. Like nobody gets special privileges from the government. That's how he viewed equal rights. And so the working man, what he should be advocating is simply that there's no special privilege that builds up monopolies, and that's your equal right. So, I mean, I don't find anything to object to on that.
No, and what you asked about presidential power, I actually like Andrew Jackson personally. I mean, he's in my politically incorrect guide to real American heroes as a real American hero. So Jackson personally, and you're correct about that. I mean, he didn't want corporate welfare, for example. I mean, so you're not going to abuse the laboring class by giving a bunch of rich guys protective tariffs or a bank where they can get richer. I mean, that was, and so this is why. Some of the lefties kind of like, this is why Schlesinger kind of liked Jackson. I mean, because he's supposedly this guy that's, this early progressive in essence. But I mean, it's a different kind of thing. It's not what the progressives would want. So certainly I think Jackson's interesting on a personal level. As a president, his abuse of power was just way over the top. So that's where I would say he's the worst. But you're right. No 19th century president, even the worst of the worst, even not a president, but even Alexander Hamilton would not compare to the current crop that we have in D.C. I would take Alexander Hamilton over Ocasio-Cortez any day of the week. He would be so much better.
Yeah, of course.
So,
Who wouldn't?
So that's without question.
All right. So that's your worst. Now let's, how about Zachary Taylor? So now we're going to 1848.
Mm-hmm. Zachary Taylor, I love. Zachary Taylor viewed himself as another George Washington. I think of any of the presidents in that period, he almost could have pulled it off. People don't realize how famous Zachary Taylor actually was when he was elected president. This is the guy that helped win the war with Mexico, and he had a tremendous amount of capital, political capital. And Polk knew it, which is why he sacked him and tried to keep him out of politics, because he thought this guy is going to become president. Now, there's a couple of things I like about Zachary Taylor. Number one, when he was going to the inauguration, right? So he's riding in a carriage with Polk, and Polk writes this in his diary. I had a conversation with Zachary Taylor, and it's something that shocked me, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he said, Zachary Taylor essentially said that he thinks California and Oregon should just secede from the United States. I mean, that's great. Can you imagine a world without California? If Taylor had his wish, we wouldn't have California at that point. I mean, wouldn't the United States be so much better off without California? So California can go. But now as president, Taylor pushed to have California admitted as a free state because he said, look, this is what California wants. So he was into self-determination. The one area that Southerners didn't like Taylor was that when they were threatening to secede in 1850, he told all the people in Texas, I'm going to hang you if you try to secede. So a lot of people think he's heavy-handed there, but Taylor certainly had the Washington view of foreign policy. If you read his speeches on the issue, he was rock solid on that. He was interested in a real union, meaning that he wanted the union to benefit all and burden all equally. He was certainly not someone who was trying to abuse power as executive. And I think that's something that's laudable about Taylor, but he only lasted a little over a year in office. So, I mean, we don't know what would have happened, but Taylor had enough political capital, I think, to keep the United States together in a way that George Washington was able to do as well back in the 1790s, when things could have blown up then, too. I mean, look, things could have blown up in 1850, and I think Taylor had the ability to keep things together without having violence. And I think that's one of the best things about his character and his personality.
Brian, I've been doing a lot of travel lately, so let me take just a minute to tell the folks that when I travel, I am the king of the airport because I'm walking around with an away carry-on. Those 4 360-degree spinner wheels make that thing glide like I'm on a cloud. It's super lightweight, yet super durable, and it's made to last for a lifetime of travel. You get a 100-day trial, so you can try any away product on the road. Limited lifetime warranty means they'll fix or replace your bag if it ever gets damaged. It's got a built-in compression pad that helps you pack more in. I'm telling you, I make good use of that. You got a removable laundry bag in there. You got a TSA-approved combination lock. It's outstanding. And my listeners rave about it too. Plus, it makes a great unexpected gift. Your friends all need this thing, but they would never think to ask you for it. So it's a great gift idea as well. Well, for $20 off a suitcase, visit awaytravel.com/woods and use promo code WOODS during checkout. That's $20 off a suitcase when you visit awaytravel.com/woods and use promo code WOODS during checkout.
All right, one more before we wrap up for today. Because if I'm having you on 5 times this week, we can't do hour-long episodes each time. I'd have to start paying my guests to come on and do this. But let's go back to the late 18th century, because there was a series on TV that I didn't watch on John Adams, and a lot of people really, really liked it. They didn't necessarily like him, but they liked the series. I don't know if you saw that series, but I'm curious about your opinions of John Adams. And maybe he's a guy who had some merits outside office, but then was a lousy president. I mean, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on him.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed the HBO series as well. It was really well done. There's this, some of these scenes in that are so good. The one where they're at the moment where they vote for the Declaration. It is just powerful because we have this idea that, of course, everyone was cheering, and we have fireworks now and hot dogs and ball games. But when they made that vote, it looked like every single one of them was just going to have a heart attack because they thought to themselves, "Oh my gosh, what did we just do? This is serious." And so it was dead silence. Great filmmaking. But besides that point, Adams takes a lot of heat, of course, and rightfully so, for signing the Alien and Sedition Acts into law. And so that's his one failing. But I think that when you look at what Adams was trying to do, he was trying to avoid war with the French and the British, which was very difficult to do. And so I think we have to give him credit for his reluctance to just rush into a war with France after the XYZ affair. So I think that's a benefit. I mean, Adams is saying, no, we don't want to do that. That would just be stupid. The Federalists are pushing for it. Here, they're forcing him to call up the military so they can go fight the French. And Adams is saying, wait, let's try to negotiate. Of course, at the same time, Washington comes out of retirement, and Hamilton is now put in charge of the United States Army. And Adams is still trying to send a diplomatic delegation to France so they can work out these differences with the French government. And ultimately that happens, right? The Treaty of Mortefontaine in 1800 settles all the problems with the French that we had. We were perpetual allies. And people have to remember how dangerous France was in the late 18th century. This is the French Revolutionary period, and then, of course, leading into the Napoleonic era, and France is extremely unstable. They're at war with everybody, right? So the United States, theoretically, then is at war with everybody, too, because we have a perpetual alliance with them. So Adams is trying to get rid of that problem, and I think we should give him credit for that. I would take John Adams over anybody in the last half century in the presidency any day of the week. He was a real Republican in that he believed in disinterested statesmanship. He was someone that didn't necessarily, he was for bigger government in the 1790s, but bigger government in the 1790s would be like Hamilton had one employee in the Treasury, right? So can you imagine the Treasury Department having 2 employees? This is what we're talking about, big government back in the 1790s. So Adams was great on, I think, overall on foreign policy. He was just really bad in that one instance with the Alien Sedition Acts, and rightfully so, lost office because of it.
All right, we're going to call it a day today, but I want people to know about the Brion McClanahan Show and about your McClanahan Academy. So say a word about that.
Yeah, right. If you want to follow the Brion McClanahan Show, just go to brionmcclanahan.com. That's BRION, McClanahan.com. You can subscribe to the podcast there. I podcast once or usually twice a week. If I'm really busy, once a week. But it's just a 30-minute drive time podcast where I can it's all monologue. So there's no callers. It's just me. And so I talk about all kinds of things. But you've got that. And then, of course, I've got my McClanahan Academy, which is how I help monetize the podcast. So if you want to go out there, it's always free to enroll there. But it's a great way to get courses. I have 7 courses now available, and you can use the coupon code WOODS and get 25% off any of those courses. You get one free for signing up, but you can get 25% off any of the courses I have for sale there. A lot of great stuff. So you can hop on over there and get more of me there as well.
All right, excellent. So we'll have links to that at tomwoods.com/1464. All right, thanks, Brian. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Thanks, Tom.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Toxic masculinity is such a commonly discussed and abused notion. It barely rates a raised eyebrow when it comes up in conversation. On the other hand, toxic femininity is a taboo subject. It's been so long taboo. I could probably convince a lot of ordinary people that it's a brand new idea. Never been discussed before, never even been conceived of. Most of the people who talk about toxic femininity are called misogynists. Most of the people who talk about toxic masculinity identify as feminists. Feminists define toxic masculinity based on their attitudes toward men. Not how men are, not how men behave, not the expectations that men have of each other or that society has of men, but how feminists think of men. I want to go a layer 3 deeper, though, than feminists tend to in my discussion of toxic gender norms, because clearly, as I outlined above, these ladies really haven't thought the whole thing through. After all, if they oppose toxic masculinity because patriarchy hurts men too and want to change and challenge the attitudes that lead to it, they probably wouldn't be among the worst offenders when it comes to enforcing, endorsing, and normalizing them, would they? Think about it. Even Fox News will admit that fathers get a shit deal these days in family court and too often lose meaningful relationships with their children for no good reason. It's only feminists who claim that men fighting for their right to remain fathers to their children are probably violent abusers or are only attempting to avoid their proper responsibility by faking a greater interest in day-to-day caring roles. So down we go into the mess of things. Going a little deeper, the causes become simpler, even as the outcomes become more diverse. What feminists claim are the expectations that real men should be violent, unemotional, and sexually aggressive, we will look at in other terms. Men are expected to be competent actors. Violence is a form of action. Sexual aggression, or in the less extreme case of sexual assertiveness, maybe sexual proceptivity, is a form of action. And emotional mastery, despite what feminists will tell you about women's greater emotional intelligence, is actually a form of competence. I would suggest to everyone here, when you go home tonight, and this is actually a really, really interesting thing, do a search on YouTube. A good term would be everyday heroes or real life heroes. There are several compilations out there. Most of them have gone viral. All of people, mostly men, doing things big or small, risky, or even just thoughtful to help out people they don't even know. In one scene I recall, an elderly woman was standing in a blizzard, kind of on a freeway on-ramp in Eastern Europe. And a man stopped his car, put it right in the middle of the road, stopped it, put his hazards on, got out of the car, went to her, took her by the elbow, and helped her cross the street, and then got back in his car and drove away. In another scene, a man waiting for the subway passed out and fell onto the tracks. Dozens of women on the platform started frantically trying to flag down the train. But it was the man who jumped down, a man who jumped down on the tracks, and it was another man who helped him pull the unconscious guy to safety. Mostly male bystanders rushing in to rescue a motorcyclist who's pinned under a burning car. A truck stalled on some railway tracks, and the guy in the car behind him jumps out and pushes it out of the way, barely in time to not get hit by the train himself. These are things that guys do. And one thing you will notice when you watch these videos is that almost without exception, it's men. Time after time after time after time after time, it's men who are doing these things. Every one of those men took action, and they were able to do so because of their emotional competence. They set aside, intentionally or otherwise, their panic, their doubt, their fear, their anxiety, their own desires or needs, and in many cases, their safety, and they acted in the service of what they saw as a greater good. They acted out of compassion, something that men, I guess they just don't have. But they're willing to risk their lives in the service of that, often. That is the essence of masculine identity in all cultures through all times, the ability to master your own fears and doubts and take action, whether it's to track down an outlaw, murder a rival, avenge a loved one, run into a burning building, or leap into a river to save someone, to stand fast on a battlefield, to take responsibility for a female partner's well-being. So, I'm going to use an example of an 11-year-old boy who was recently raped by his then 20-year-old babysitter. The perpetrator had been sexually involved with the boy's father, and she knew the boy's age. But somehow she managed to convince the judge that the boy had convinced her that he was actually 15. And somehow the father's testimony that his son was, he's sex mad and saw the incident as a notch on his belt was given more weight than the boy's own testimony that he didn't enjoy the experience at all because he knew it was wrong. The woman was given a suspended sentence. Yes, no jail time. She has to register as a sex offender, but only for 7 years, and her probationary supervision and restrictions will only last for 2. Her defense attorney had this to say. She was vulnerable, and she'd had a hard upbringing, spending 2 years in hospital with leukemia between the ages of 5 and 7. The judge added that she was very emotionally immature, and that reduced the age difference in terms of relative levels of emotional development. So the conclusions in this case are as follows. The boy essentially wanted it and was not harmed by it, even though by his own testimony he was. and he didn't. The woman was at the mercy of her own emotions, which she could not be expected to control because the circumstances of her life had been difficult. The boy managed to convince her that he was not 11 but 15, despite the fact that she knew he was 11. And so he brought it on himself. He said, "I'm 15," so he caused it to happen. Men commenting on the case are much more likely than women to say, "I only wish I was that kid," or "lucky bastard," or any number of other sentiments that erase the fact that this boy was a victim of something that he did not choose or want. That's what we call hyperagency. That's what we call assuming that everything that a man encounters in his life is something that he wanted, something that he caused, something that he earned, something that he did. There are very few cases where the difference between the assumptions and expectations of masculinity and femininity are more clear than this one. Masculine identity centers almost entirely around perceptions of agency, one's own perceptions and the perceptions of others. And feminine identity, and this is where it's going to get toxic, is much more capable of assuming object status. And let me be clear, I'm not using the word object as a synonym for dehumanizing. That's the way feminists use it, but that's not what it is. There's a very good paper, actually, that discredits all of their rhetoric on objectification, and if anybody wants a link to that, I can provide it for you after the talk. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to go by these basic definitions. Agents make things happen. Objects have things happen to them. A great deal of our cultural discourse around men and women, including a huge amount of feminist discourse, is about the things men do and the things women suffer at the hands of men, reinforcing men's status as agents and women's status as objects. Admitting that you have been victimized, that something has happened to you that you did not want, choose, or cause in any way whatsoever, well, it's just a lot easier for a woman than a man. It's much easier for others to accept that and acknowledge it regarding women than men, because it doesn't conflict with our cultural and biological perceptions of what is a woman. A woman can be a victim and still be perceived as a woman. A man cannot be a victim and remain a man in the eyes of others, and often even himself. This is particularly true regarding the ways men are vulnerable because they are men. I can't even convey to you the number of times I've managed to convince a man that yes, males are the majority of victims of violence in every single society on the planet. Males, no matter the gender of the perpetrator, women or men, violence is more likely to be perpetrated on a male than a female. And that pattern begins before age 1. Basically, it begins when babies start to crawl. That's the point when their parents start hitting boys 2 to 3 times more often than they hit girls. And that man will stick to his guns and insist that violence is a bigger problem for women, and that society doesn't take it seriously enough, that the VAWA and the thousands of beds in shelters and the mandatory arrest policies and all of that doesn't go far enough to deal with the problem of violence against women. And they will often say this moments after they have conceded that violence is a larger, more ubiquitous problem for men, and even when they have accepted that women are as likely to be violent with men as men are to be violent with women. If toxic masculinity is exemplified by the assumption that men cannot be real men, if they are victims, then toxic femininity is the assumption that women are uniquely victims, and that their identity as women is partially defined by their victimhood. Their victimhood at the hands of men, at the hands of patriarchy, at the hands of the beauty industry, at the hands of rape culture, male privilege, toxic masculinity, and institutionalized sexism. It is the assumption that the multitudes of studies demonstrating that they are often not unique victims, that men are equally likely to be victims of sexual and physical violence, sexist assumptions, negative stereotypes, rigid gender expectations, all of that, that these studies are wrong or false or problematic or not to be believed. I can't begin to tell you the number of times I have actually convinced a black man that driving while black is actually driving while black and male, and that it would probably never happen to his mother or his sister. And he will admit that. Yeah, that would probably never happen to my mom or my sister. But I still don't think I've ever been discriminated against for being male. And it's probably still harder on my mom and my sister to be black. Anything to not be seen as a victim or a potential victim because you are male, because that, my friends, means that you are not an agent, and therefore you're not a real man. It is women who are acted upon. It is women who are objects who do not act, but rather endure the acts of others. If women are the victim class, then a man who admits to being a victim cannot remain a man. When it comes to interactions with the opposite sex, the tendency is even greater because of that pesky notion that women don't actually do things, but instead have things done to them, while men are the ultimate cause of things happening. What could undermine a man's sense of agency, which is so central to his cultural identity, to his social acceptance, more effectively than being raped by an object, by someone who can't do things, by someone who's seen as ineffective, seen as not an agent. Much better to treat that rape like a notch on your belt and pretend to revel in the high fives. So you can see this in relation to physical violence too. A man hits a woman, there's no excuse that can ever justify it. There's nothing she could possibly have done to deserve it. A woman hits a man, I wonder what he did to deserve that. I bet he was cheating on her. Maybe he was getting fresh with her. All of these actions we will attribute to him in our own thoughts, kind of automatically. That will transform her action into a reaction to some initial action on his part that we imagine he must have done. Our instant assumption is that her violence was provoked or self-defensive or even due to some other thing outside her control, like PMS or a mental disorder, or because we still, because we will resist seeing her as an agent in whom a desire to act can actually originate and then be acted on. So our assumption regarding the victimized man is that he chose or caused what happened in some way, or at the very least, he could have taken some action to have stopped it from happening. He remains the agent, the hyper-agent in the scenario. So let's go back and see what we can discern of toxic femininity in geek feminism's list. The idea that male-female interactions are a competition, not cooperation. What is feminism? What is it but the demand by a minority of women to do away with male-female cooperation and redefine men and women as opposing teams? Redefine marriage as an institution designed to exploit women for men's benefit. Redefine the sexes as if they were nations at war. The first inklings of this mindset can be found in the Declaration of Sentiments, and they linger even now in feminism's constant lament about wage gaps and the lack of female representation in STEM or on corporate boards. The assumption is not a patriarchal norm. It's not. It's a feminist one. It's not toxic masculinity, it's toxic femininity. Or this one. Though not reinforced much in fictional media, in real life it is widely expected that a man would abandon his pregnant girlfriend and is incapable and or unwilling to take responsibility. Traditional masculinity has been constructed largely to hold men responsible for the children they helped create. It was a masculine ideal among men. In fact, it was part of what could be considered to be a tradition of masculine honor, socially constructed and institutionally reinforced by males themselves. If there are any feminists in the audience, I would like to ask you, do you agree with legally enforced child support? Do you think men should be held legally, financially responsible for children they didn't agree to create because they gave their consent because they didn't give their consent to the obligations of parenthood when they agreed to have sex? More than this, what about women? If she didn't want kids, she should have kept her legs closed. I mean, we've all heard if he didn't want kids, he should have kept it in his pants, right? What do feminists have to say about that, right? about women wanting to opt out of the responsibility that they took on. You know, they made their choice. If they made their choice when they had sex, like men do, then all of these things that feminists have brought about, the morning after pill, abortion, safe havens, all of this stuff, right? Wouldn't that be toxic femininity? Wanting to get out of your responsibilities? Assuming, having a whole system based on the assumption that you would want to get out of those responsibilities? For women, sex and reproduction have been completely decoupled. Well, there is such a thing as an accidental pregnancy, there is no such thing as an accidental birth, and there's very definitely no such thing as accidental motherhood. Since even after birth, women have both a de jure and a de facto right to absolve themselves of the responsibility of parenthood. Motherhood is not the result of an accident, and it's certainly not the result of something men do to women through the massive, immense patriarchal power of their ejaculations. Not in this day and age. It's the result of a series of unilateral decisions on the part of any given woman. No woman in the West is forced to consent to becoming a mother just because she consented to sex. Yet feminism has only further codified the patriarchal norm that men should indeed be held responsible for the children that they had a hand in creating, despite the fact that nowadays women hold unilateral power of decision over whether or not they themselves will become parents. When I talk about legal paternal surrender, the impression I get from feminists is that a man's single decision and action to ejaculate is to them more powerful than a woman's entire gamut of autonomous reproductive choices. He got her pregnant. And the baby? The baby just happened. Again, we force men into the role of active agent. And, you know, they can affect those around them. They affect those around them just by existing. And women into the role of passive object at the mercy of outside forces. And if an abortion is more difficult or costly to obtain than a haircut, well, she's a victim of that too. We assign him agency even when he doesn't have it, and we hold him responsible, yet for all her power, she is still the victim. So here we kind of come full circle. If much of toxic masculinity is based on the assumption that men are indeed agents, much of toxic femininity is based on the assumption that women are objects who are acted upon, and therefore they are unique victims. And this is where things get sticky, because as Warren Farrell said once, men's greatest weakness is their facade of strength, and women's greatest strength is their facade of weakness. So why? Why would this be? Why do we see men and women in these ways? Why do men avoid being perceived as victims, at least in terms of being victims as men, while women increasingly seem to revel in an identity steeped in how they are acted on? In my opinion, it's for the same reason. Societies have always gone out of their way to preserve women and children, often at the cost of men's lives. It's just male disposability. And that brings me around to Lady Macbeth. Is an archetypical literary example of toxic femininity. A woman hungry for power and status above her own goads her husband to act on her behalf. She goads him by undermining his masculinity. She goads him through shame. She goads him by revoking his man card. At the end, she goads him by telling him she's more of a man than he is. She's more honorable in her promises and more willing to sacrifice something dear to her in order to preserve that honor. Shakespeare knew men and women at least that well, though I've often wondered over the last 5 or 6 years if his view of Lady Macbeth might have been a bit rosy. Because later in the play, driven mad by guilt over her role in the murder of King Duncan, she committed suicide. And I've always wondered if a fan fiction alternate ending might actually be more realistic. One where she feels no guilt, and where standing on a field of the dead, her own husband among them, she attaches herself to the nearest, next powerful man, and regales himself with stories of how Macbeth was a cruel and vicious husband who was not capable of loving her properly. And why would I think Lady Macbeth would do that? Because she can, yo.
And I was just curious, do you think people would be as successful listening to you if you were a man speaking the same?
A man speaking the same thing? Booed out of the building. Booed out of the building. And because, I mean, this is sort of a friendly audience. You guys are all aware of what I'm talking about here. You know, nobody's sprung anything on you. You're not going to be shocked by what I say. But I've gone in front of, like yesterday, in front of audiences of libertarians who none of them have heard of any of it. They've never thought about it, right? And they seem to react just fine to me. But I've also had men email me, even men email me and say, I stumbled across one of your videos, and I just want to say, you know, like, I was really mad for the first 5 minutes watching it. And if you were a guy, I would have just clicked away and I wouldn't have listened, right? So, I mean, it really does temper the message when it comes out of a woman's mouth. It makes it less scary. I can get away with saying way more controversial things than most guys, so it's nice. Well, I think women are probably going to have to be the vanguard, and I mean, it's a real shame, but when you have a situation where if a man is going to, if he's going to talk about feminism and the fact that it's unjust, right, or it's not about equality, it harms people, it harms men, it harms children, you know, whatever. He's either going to be, people are going to say he's dangerous, right, and angry, and he's not going to get any sympathy. Or they're going to say he's a whiny man baby, and he's not going to get any sympathy. Or he's essentially a privileged man who's just looking to hold on to his unearned privilege, in which case he's not going to get any sympathy. So in order to, like, women are going to need to break the ice. We're going to be the icebreakers. Men need to actually start advocating for themselves, but honestly, like, a friend of mine said that women sort of need to be human shields for men who want to do this kind of work, who want to raise awareness. We have to be the bulletproof vest for you guys, because they're not gonna come after us the way they come after you guys. I mean, like, we picked the name honey badger because the honey badger is renowned as the most fearless animal on the planet and all that. But you don't have to be fearless to do this as a woman. You really don't. You have to be fearless to do it as a man.